corpus analysis allows us to take an in-depth look at an author's style or the standards of the genre or a specific subject matter for the purpose of seeing how grammatical choices have rhetorical effects. And maybe you think that you shouldn't care or it doesn't matter, but it does, and you should, because how we write, how we speak, and how we receive this information is the basis of communication. And we can learn a lot about what an author is really saying by the way that they choose to say it. And if you don't believe me, let me prove it by the way that David Foster Wallace uses a long series to force his audience to feel the weight of this complex world. I'm Ray Carruthers, and this is Creating Chaos. Now, David Foster Wallace is an already well-written about author, as his writing style is uniquely his own, and everyone wants to get the last word about it. Simon de Beausire, author and previous professor of postmodern literature, analyzes David Foster Wallace's fiction in detail. While this writing style is often satirized, de Beausire looks at it as an intentional method of creating character and unstable fictional worlds. Other people like Josh Royland, a writer and assistant professor of journalism in the Department of English at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, took an in-depth look at his literary journalism and uses a philosophical concept from Nietzsche to discuss the way that David Foster Wallace lacked a screening device to separate what he observed in the world from his consciousness, making for painful impressions on his psyche. This is important because, quote, as a journalist, Wallace's job was to collect and organize the noise and agitation of the phenomenal world. And through this, we can truly see that noise and agitation in his writing style. Terry Hike, former teacher and founder and director of Teach Thought, an organization dedicated to humanizing education, discussed David Foster Wallace through his professorship lens, and I think he sums it up quite nicely. David Foster Wallace was, quote, equal part non-conforming, angst-ridden rebel and submissive lover of formal language and all its rules and sentence diagramming splendor. So now that we've got the who, let's get to the what. Jane Fattenstock, professor of English at the University of Maryland and author of Rhetoric, discusses the idea of a series. In standard English grammar, a series is that succession of three. It's what we're comfortable with, it's what we expect to see on the screen. But she also discusses what happens when you go past that. When you get to items in a list that are 4 and 5 and 6, it actually makes your audience pay closer attention to the individual items in the series because it disrupts what we're expecting to see on the screen. Richard Nordquist, professor of English and rhetoric at Georgia Southern University and author in Grammar of Composition, discusses other important concepts in this, such as end weight and end focus. The sentence you see here is an example of a series that we're comfortable with, but what happens when we do this? Nordquist discusses the ideas of how naturally in English grammar, end focus is going to happen. It's this idea that what falls at the end of the sentence is what gets the most emphasis. It's what your readers remember. So by using end weight, literally picking the piece of the series that is the longest and putting it at the end, we're getting the most focus. It's what your readers are going to hang on to. And so while you may forget that I put my blood into this project, you're not going to forget that I put my last shred of dignity into it. Other important concepts in the idea of a long series is how we choose to separate those pieces. Martha Cohn, author of numerous books on grammar and its rhetorical effects, writes about two concepts called polysyndeton and asyndeton. Polysyndeton is what you see on the screen here. It is when we use use conjunction in accession. So what you see here is the use of and repeatedly in between those pieces. It's most commonly seen with and or. And what it does is it drives separation in between those pieces, and you get greater emphasis falling on the individual items. Asyndeton is the opposite. We use it for the purpose of ambiguity. By throwing commas in between, we speed the reader up. We create a sense of freedom where they have no idea where this list is going to end. So now that you've got the who and the what, so what did I actually do for this project? The corpus itself was six nonfiction essays by author David Foster Wallace. As noted before, he was a writer that has produced fiction, which has already been widely analyzed, worked as a professor for a short time, and finally went out as a literary journalist to create some truly fascinating pieces of nonfiction. I focus my analyzation on the first 30 sentences of each of the pieces you see here. And David Foster Wallace uses sentences like the one you just saw a lot. This many times, to be exact. What you're seeing here is a basic breakdown of how many times a example of long series showed up in about the first page and a half of each essay. So when it's said that David Foster Wallace writes with a level of complexity and chaos, they mean it. But what does he mean by it? Just as I said before, as a literary journalist, he had the moral responsibility to go out and investigate the chaos of the world. And what better way to bring your audience to see it than putting them in it? Let's take a closer look. The example you're going to see here is a quote from Tennis, Trigonometry, and Tornadoes, an essay originally published in the Harper's. It was essentially about what you can expect. David Foster Wallace being a lover of math, a childhood tennis prodigy, and living in Tornado Valley. So what you're seeing here after the colon there is a line of description, and it's setting the scene for his readers. And so we're not getting one word adjectives to describe the scene, and we're not getting a few pieces either. This is the level of 3 that we're expecting to see, but he doesn't stop there. He keeps going. And by doing that, he's overwhelming his readers with description, and he's doing so finally to set a scene. And I can feel this, can't you? Other examples come from Big Red Sun. It's an essay about the Adult Video News Awards, originally published in a collection of essays in his book, Consider the Lobster. In this example here, we're getting a good example of end weight, because even though he manipulates the form, he's doing so in the middle of a sentence, he's still giving us the same thing. These are 3 pieces in a series that we're expecting to see. We associate these things with annual, but then he does this. And that makes you pause for a second, doesn't it? Because it's on purpose. You would naturally associate annual sales, and you're expecting to see it. So it's so natural that you're not gonna forget it. But by throwing video, masturbation, booth revenues at the end, he's doing something. He's throwing all of that weight and all of that attention on that piece. Even in the middle of a sentence, you're not gonna forget that. This excerpt here is coming from Shipping Out, on the nearly lethal comforts of a luxury cruise, where he discusses the pains of being pampered on a cruise. Other examples of this come from Ticket to the Fair and David Lynch Keeps His Head, also examples of investigative journalism. And in this example, David Foster Wallace is using that long series again, but he's doing so with dependent clauses rather than phrases or words. And that has a different effect. In this example, we're not just getting an idea of what the guests asked about, but we're getting it in a question word form. So you can actually hear the level of stupidity in the question by the way that he forms it in the sentence. And he does so, again, in excess. So you're not getting a little bit of stupidity, but a lot of it. He's giving this stupidity a voice. Finally, we have an example from Tense Present, Democracy, English, and the Wars Over Usage. Now this is a very, very critiqued essay by David Foster Wallace, where he discusses his personal appreciation for English grammar, but also his disdain for its practice or lack thereof in society, also originally published in the Harper's. In this example, he's using polysyndeton, like we discussed earlier, by using an excess of conjunction in between the pieces. And by doing that, he's creating further separation between each of the pieces, and he's doing so that we are getting extra weight on top of those pieces. And he's doing this to create a level of pretension, a level of annoyance in his audience. He's not throwing these things in casually. He's giving you a separation that is purposely frustrating his audience as a strict grammarian perspective. David Foster Wallace was a complex man, fighting complex demons, investigating a complex world, and to get his readers to comprehend even a sliver of this chaos. By throwing an audience into a long string of description or dependent clauses or oddly worded phrases, he is making us experience this agitation firsthand. And this is not an indirect consequence of his writing, but an intentional, stylistic choice that he makes to create the atmosphere that we need to really get it.